I offered prayers to Christ, who was alive. Then I raced down the hill on the left and raced up the hill on the right, to offer thanks to Lord Krishna for having put Jesus of Nazareth, whose humanity I found so compelling, in my way. I first heard a line like that a few years ago from a coworker. It was half remembered as a quote from the film adaptation of Life of Pi. I don't really remember the context. I just remember standing there and feeling like I'd been handed a sentence that I wasn't quite ready to understand yet. At the time, all I really knew about Life of Pi was that it involved a boy, a tiger, a boat, and the ocean. Someone was lost at sea, and there was an island, maybe. After finally reading the novel, I think Life of Pi is a book that patiently invites us to explore faith, wonder, and meaning. And then, at the very end, it asks a more unsettling question. What if none of that exploration was ever allowed to be true in the first place? Because by the end of Life of Pi, faith isn't presented as something that reveals truth. It's actually presented as something that protects us from it. So I'm not convinced the ending does what the book thinks it does. What if Life of Pi isn't actually defending faith, but turning God into a coping mechanism? Before we get there, though, we need to understand Pi's unique approach to religion. Because while it isn't common, it isn't completely invented either. We often package religions as self-contained systems. This is Hinduism. This is Christianity. This is Islam. We treat them as mutually exclusive, as if believing in one rules out the others. It's like being asked whether you walked to work or you took the bus. Saying both wouldn't make much sense. But is that really how all religions work? For some of them, clearly yes. You shall have no other gods before me, declares the Torah. In the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have historically taken that command very seriously. In my own early exposure to evangelical Christianity, this exclusivity was explicit. I remember learning the so-called ABCs of faith at a church camp when I was around 11 years old. A. Accept that you are a sinner. B. Believe that Jesus of Nazareth died for your sins. C. Confess your belief and your sins to God. These weren't presented as one path among many. They were presented as the path. But not all religious traditions work this way. In the Hindu Advaita Vedanta tradition, deities like Krishna, Shiva, or Ganesh are often understood as manifestations of a single ultimate reality, Brahma. It's somewhat like the Christian belief that Jesus is an incarnation of God, except that incarnation isn't limited to a single historical figure. From that perspective, the Vedanta tradition isn't really polytheistic at all. It's closer to a kind of monotheism with many faces. This is the theological space that Pi occupies. On the surface, he appears to combine incompatible religions, calling himself Hindu, Christian, and Muslim all at once. But through a Vedantic lens, that combination isn't incoherent. That's why it doesn't produce the same internal conflict for Pi that it might for someone raised in a strictly exclusivist tradition. From that other point of view, thanking Krishna for encountering Jesus isn't openness, it's heresy. We see this tension play out when Pi is confronted by the leaders of the three faiths he practices. He's seen as a good Christian boy. I hope to see him in our choir soon, says the priest. You must be mistaken. He is a good Muslim boy. He comes without fail to Friday prayer, counters the imam. You're both wrong. He's a good Hindu boy. I see him all the time at the temple, interjects the pandit. Pi refuses to resolve the dispute. Instead, he says, there are always those who take it upon themselves to defend God, as if ultimate reality, as if the sustaining frame of existence were something weak and helpless. In refusing to take sides, Pi does something that's kind of radical. He actually takes God seriously. So often, religious belief functions less as reverence and more as identity. It becomes a way of signaling, this is my group, these are my people, and they're definitely different from yours. Underneath that signaling, there's often a subtle defensiveness. There's a need to define God precisely, to fence God in with doctrines and boundaries. That's strange when you think about it. The rest of reality doesn't work that way. We don't get to define gravity. It exists whether we believe in it or not. We can observe it, we can measure it, calculate it, but we don't get to decide what it is. So if God is real, if God is alive, then why would God be any different? Why would God be something we could fully contain in language or in doctrine? Think about it this way. Your friends may know you well, but can they ever fully define you? Can any description completely capture who you are? If that's true for human beings, how much more might it be true for the ultimate nature of reality itself? Some readers argue that Pi doesn't really understand the religions he practices, and yet the Imam tells him, "We Muslims stick to the essential miracle of existence. Birds flying, rain falling, crops growing. These are miracles enough." That seems self-evident, but in the same breath, Pi is asked to affirm, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger, a claim that is far less obvious. Christianity contains a similar tension. Pi describes priests as people whose profession it is to love, and yet Christian history is filled with bitter doctrinal disputes, sometimes violent ones. At the Council of Nicaea, St. Nicholas of Myra reportedly struck Arius of Alexandria over a theological disagreement. Yeah, that's the same St. Nicholas that inspired Santa Claus. He once punched somebody at a church meeting. So which version of religion is closer to the truth? Is it the humble, awestruck faith that marvels at existence itself? Or is it the legalistic faith that demands precision, certainty, and intellectual control? The first kind of faith appears in mystical traditions like Sufism in Islam or Hesychasm in Christianity. It pushes believers beyond arguments and into silence. The second version is often the one skeptics encounter, and it's the easiest to dismiss. Compared to that, Pi's supposedly naive pluralism begins to look not confused, but deeply reverent. All of this prepares us for the novel's central question. Which story matters more, the one that is true, or the one that helps us live? Near the end of the book, Pi asks, since it makes no factual difference to you, and you can't prove the question either way, which story do you prefer? This refers to the novel's dual narratives. In the first story, Pi survives a shipwreck alongside a Bengal tiger, amusingly named Richard Parker. It's a fantastical tale of courage, imagination, and endurance. In the second, there is no tiger. Instead, Pi is trapped on a lifeboat with his mother, an injured sailor, and a brutal cook. The sailor dies. The cook eats him. The cook then kills Pi's mother, and eventually, Pi kills the cook. Both stories explain how Pi reaches Mexico. Neither one can be proven. So, which story do you prefer? This is meant to be the book's final defense of faith. Religion, we're told, is the better story. It's richer, it's more humane, it's more meaningful. But this argument is weaker than it first appears, because the novel strongly implies that the darker story, the one involving the cook murdering Pi's mother, is actually the one more likely to be true. And in doing so, it concedes something enormous. It concedes that religious stories may not describe objective reality at all. Historically, religious traditions have strongly resisted this concession. They didn't argue merely that their stories were meaningful, but that they were true. Here, that claim is abandoned. The argument is no longer, this is how the world is. Instead, it becomes, This is how we cope. And that's a deal that any secular skeptic would gladly accept. Yes, the tiger story is easier to live with, but it doesn't eliminate suffering. Pi still loses his family. He still commits violence to survive. Pain and loss remain. The better story doesn't end suffering, it reframes it. And in reframing it, the question of truth, well, it's just let quietly slip away. One of the most common critiques of religion from a secular perspective is that it functions as a psychological crutch, an opiate of the masses. It's a way to avoid facing reality. And here, Pi effectively agrees. Religion is a coping mechanism. Even if Pi wants to argue that meaning doesn't depend on factual accuracy, the ground has already shifted. But that's not all. I actually think there's a deeper problem with this argument. And it's not with the secular materialist, but rather with the religious thinker. In the book of Job, we read, "Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna urges Arjuna to act rightly without attachment to outcomes. These traditions don't teach us to demand a better story. They teach us to relinquish that demand. Early in the novel, Pi seems to understand this. He refuses to defend God as if God were fragile. He responds with reverent awe. But that posture doesn't survive until the ending. By insisting on a subjectively better story, Pi starts placing conditions on God. He tries to reassert human control over what was meant to transcend it. There is suffering in the world. Tiger or no tiger, Pi's family still dies. He still loses his innocence. He still has to rebuild his life alone. Is the tiger story truly better? Or does calling it better simply allow us to turn away? In Christianity, Christ calls his followers to take up their cross and follow him, toward suffering, toward death. God himself does not escape pain in that story. Instead, God enters it. A mature spirituality doesn't use faith as an escape hatch. It doesn't demand comfort. It accepts reality as it is. And when we let go of the need for a better story, something interesting happens. We begin to see that our hunger for meaning may have been the ego at work all along. Because to believe that only a grand narrative can justify our lives is to assume that without one, our lives are meaningless. But is that true? Or is that just another story we tell ourselves? Letting go of the need for a better story may be the moment we realize that our lives already carry meaning. God or no God, story or no story,